It's Elaine again, with another review, because I have opinions, about Moby Dick by Herman Melville. So this is not my first time reading Moby Dick. I read this back in high school, and I loved it back then. But the reason I loved it at the time was I thought of it as a really great tangential book. It was the first book I had ever read that just sort of went off and did its own thing at random-ass moments, and for someone with ADHD, you know, that seemed cool. Rereading it now, I realize there really are no tangents in this book. Everything that is in this book is there for a reason, and all of it's building towards the story. It's just not all of it's readily apparent at first glance. And the reason almost everything exists in this book is about either point of view or humanity. Okay, so first, Moby Dick is a story of a voyage of a whaling boat. It is narrated by a man who asks us to call him Ishmael, but he's never actually named. He admits at the very beginning he has never sailed on a whaling ship before. He has sailed, and it is implied he's done numerous other crafts, but now he wants to try something new. He ends up meeting a harpooner named Queequeg, and together they sign on to sail on the Pequod, a ship run by an eccentric captain named Ahab. Ahab is missing one leg because it was recently bitten off by a legendary white whale called Moby Dick. And now the man is out for revenge. He enlists his crew to help him on his quest to find and kill this whale that bit off his leg, no matter what the cost. But objectively, the majority of the book is made up of just talking about whaling. Like, if you hear the description of this book, you think it's going to be a lot more action-packed than it is. A lot of it is introspective examination of human endeavors. The point of view of this book really should not work. It starts with a very loud, clear, and strong voice. We get to know Ishmael very well in the beginning of the book. We get to know a bit about his past. We know he's a lighthearted, philosophical, and empathetic young man. His relationship with Queequeg seems to be a major building block of this book, like you really think it's going to be important. And then he sort of just disappears until the epilogue. There's even a scene in this book that he is featured in that we only find out afterwards that he was there. I mean, and like throughout the book, he is still there. We hear his voice in the way many of the characters are examined, but he himself is almost never actually there. Like, we don't hear the name Ishmael for about 300 pages. And the characters are examined in this book. I think that's why we lose Ishmael so completely, is because even though we know he's the one telling the story, we are hearing the private conversations and the innermost thoughts of a large portion of the crew. We get to know them as POV characters, even though technically it's not their point of view. And I think that's why the book is so enduringly good, and why it has something of a reputation of an anti-racist book, because these characters are really diverse. There are people from a lot of different areas that fit a lot of different descriptions, and almost every single one of them are given these full, round souls. The biggest exception is Fedallah, I think is how you're supposed to pronounce it, and the crew of Ahab's boat, all of whom are Asian, which is problematic. And like, some of the language used to describe these people is really problematic. At one point he calls them his arms and his legs. And I think that's a lot of what Melville is doing with this book. Not all, because Christ on crutches, there's so much that Melville is doing with this book. But this book is about individuals being subsumed by a monstrous, larger-than-life obsessive personality. Ahab is described as a madman, a god, a devil, a force of nature, while we are constantly reminded of his human weakness by the use of his lost leg. But the entire crew, short of Starbuck, fold into his will. They become part of his will, like he's a cult leader. And really he is. Long before the psychology of a cult had ever been evaluated, Melville seems to have struck on what makes a cult leader powerful. It is Ahab's intensity that draws everyone along with him. Even Starbuck, who knows Ahab is batshit crazy, can't bring himself to directly defy him, and it's always attributed to the intense look in Ahab's eyes, the sound of his voice, the feeling that there must be something more to Ahab's quest than human will, because there is so much power to Ahab, and it's all just intensity. But of course, there's not. Ahab is just a guy. He's an arrogant, vengeful man who sees other people as tools he has a right to use. While our narrator sees each of these people as full humans of great value, Ahab only sees them as they are useful to him. By the end of the book, I'm going to read you a quote. "They were one man, not 30. For as the one ship that held them all, though it was put together of all contrasting things, oak and maple, and pine wood, iron and pitch, and hemp, yet all these ran into each other in one concrete hull, which shot on its way, both balanced and directed by the long central keel. Even so, all the individualities of the crew, this man's valor, that man's fear, guilt and guiltiness, all varieties were welded into oneness, and were all directed to that fatal goal which Ahab, their one lord and keel, did point to. When all of them bow to Ahab's will, they cease to be people. They cease to have their own individualities and just become objects. One object, with no power to steer themselves. And of course, Moby Dick is a tragedy. Spoiler alert, it does not end well. Almost everybody dies. And I think that at least Melville believes that these two things may be related. Maybe you shouldn't let your will be subsumed by a megalomaniac, asshole who thinks that you're tools to hunt down a whale. So, we see Ahab's death coming 1.5 miles away, but I do not mourn him. I mourn everyone else. Starbuck, Queequeg, Pip, and Flask. And hell, you're mourning them through most of the book because you can sort of feel that it's coming. They are all intensely human and likable. And while they are dying, Ahab is thinking about his ship. I sort of hate Ahab from the moment he appears until he unceremoniously dies. And I think I'm supposed to. Ahab is the part of all of us that thinks we matter more than everyone else. Ahab is the part of us that says, my obsessions are meaningful. My quest must be fulfilled. And in the end, his stupid quest gets more than 30 people killed. Because Moby Dick don't give a shit. There's a lot in this book about man setting himself up against nature, because objectively that's a large portion of what Moby Dick represents, as well as several other things, God, and I don't know. But there are even a couple passages in this book that sound an awful lot like direct nods to Don Quixote. But Don Quixote's tilting at windmills was relatively innocent and harmless, whereas Ahab is tilting at windmills that tilt back, and it gets a buttload of people killed. One of the things I do find interesting about this book is how it starts out so incredibly light. It's playful and funny at the beginning, and it just gets really dark by the end. But that sort of makes sense because there's a lot going on with contrast in this book. There's a lot of examining beauty in horror, the wisdom in stupidity, power in the weak. This book shows a lot of pity for the monstrous as well as the traditionally pitiful. It finds poetry in menial manual labor of a very horrific industry. And unlike some books, it doesn't feel like Melville was just unaware that this was horrific. He wants you to see the horror right alongside the beauty. And of course, I think part of the reason that this book has always been seen as a gloriously subversive book is that it shows intense depth and philosophy in men that are usually portrayed as simple. There's a metric shit ton of queer subtext in this book as well. Some of it's so obvious that, honestly, you can barely call it subtext. It is text. There's one section where Queequeg literally says that Ishmael is his wife, and then they go to sleep in bed together. And I don't think I'm reading too much into this, or this is one of those, like, it was different in those times kind of thing, because Ishmael almost immediately goes on a tangent about how, oh, that's not gay, that's totally Queequeg's culture, they do this. Yeah, totally. It is literally the 1850s version of no homo. There's also something interesting going on with religion and God in this book, but I just didn't have the energy to really examine it too tightly. The thing that I keep going back to about Moby Dick is a lot of people talk about this book as being long, but it's not. That's not much longer than most of the books I read. What it is dense. Every page can be examined, thought over, reread, and lived in for a day or two. Like, usually when I finish a chapter in a book, if I put the book down immediately, I'm still thinking about what, like, happens next and wanting to pick it back up. Whereas in Moby Dick, I finished a chapter, put it down, and just didn't have the desire to read for a while because I was thinking about what had just happened. And, like, the chapters in this book are primarily 2 to 3 pages at most, and chapters that, sure, usually drive me batshit bonkers. But it didn't in this book. Because it feels like we've covered as much distance as we possibly could before we needed a break. And we may have covered half the Earth and an entire man's lifetime in those 2-page chapters. So overall, yeah, I would say that Moby Dick is definitely worth a read. And a reread. Though there are a lot of references that generally you're going to have to look up to get. If you want to look them up, more power to you. I know I did when I read it back in high school, but I did not when I read it this time. And I know some chapters would make more sense if I had taken the time to really look up every reference, but this is a dense enough book. I feel like you can just sort of slide by some of those references and go, yeah, it would probably make more sense if I remembered that passage of the Bible. Or, yeah, this would probably have more meaning if I remembered the legend of that particular Greek god. But I think sometimes we all need permission to just acknowledge we don't know what the reference means, and that we might be missing some, you know, depth. But in the end, it's okay. You've got the story. You have my permission to not look up things you don't want to. Because I feel like that's often a barrier to people when they're reading books that are anything older than from the 1950s. They're afraid that they're going to have to stop and look things up, and nobody really wants to carry a dictionary and, you know, a cell phone with them to Google every single thing they're reading. So you have my permission to just slide on by, read them and keep moving. But overall, I will say also, I apologize, this review has turned out a lot more like an essay than an actual review. I did a lot more literary analysis than I initially intended to, but in my defense, Moby Dick, there's a reason people love reading this book in schools. There is so much you can delve into. You can choose any metaphor you want and just spend 40 pages talking about it. So I apologize. I couldn't help myself. I hope you enjoy Moby Dick.